Why Spain? I mean, this is the question we're asking us. Why Spain? Why is a country, a few years ago, was probably at the end of an investor list in terms of institutional investors, become, in terms of global destination, this is direct investment, doesn't include M&A, doesn't include indirect investment, become globally the fourth destination in terms of direct real estate investment. You know, what's changed over the past couple of years? What do investors see moving forward in terms of potential for the market? Now, as always, before I speak at conferences, I tend to consult with my team. And I say to them, you know, guys, girls, you know, what is it about Spain? You know, what's driving all this? The first response was, well, you know, tourism, Reno. We've got 82 million tourists. That's the size of Germany in Spain every single year. Is it because we've got more bars and restaurants than anywhere else in the world? For the investor tours, the investors like to come down and actually see, you know, how we live. There were some funny comments. Is it because we brought chocolate over to the Western world? We invented the mop. We actually invented lollipops. It's probably a mixture of all this, but I think what we've got, quite honestly, is confidence. I think that's the key here. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the economic side because we've been through that, but I think what investors see clearly in Spain at the moment is this potential. You look at the GDP graph over there, both in terms of total GDP, but also GDP per capita. We're 15% up on where we were at the top of the last cycle. We're 29% above where we were at the bottom of the cycle. You know, people see confidence, but we see confidence without actually building too many homes. And you actually look at the right-hand side, you'll see that we are building, but nothing compared to where we were in 2007, 2008. It's sustainable. We've reshaped, rebalanced the economy. So, you know, what's that leading to in terms of the property markets? And what I want to do is just cover very briefly. I actually haven't got that much time. I can say I'm going to be under pressure if I speak too long. Let me go into detail as to what's driving this and what investors see in terms of the office market, the logistics market. We'll talk a bit about retail, and we'll talk a bit about alternative. Let's talk about offices. Now, what we're seeing in Madrid, we're seeing sustained demand for office accommodation. You look at growth in terms of the services sector this year, we're estimating about 37,000 new jobs coming in. Last year's gross take-up actually was pretty much in line with the previous year at about 540,000 square meters, but we actually didn't have the impact of the public sector. Now people say, look, Reno, looking at the graph, you still haven't reached the levels of occupancy, you know, gross demand that we saw at the last cycle. Well, I said, well, look, guys, demand itself has changed. Occupiers actually use their space differently. We had occupancy ratios back in 2007, 2008 of 15 square meters for each employee. We're now probably down to about 10. So if we start looking at where we are in terms of the cycle, it's pretty comparable to where we were in 2007, 2008. Well, people say, well, what about the vacancy position? Well, that's also an important issue to understand. We see clearly a focus on quality space. Occupiers are concerned about workplace strategy. They're looking for the best accommodation. Indeed, if we actually look at the market now, about 40% of the demand is focused on the top quality space. So if we compare gross vacancies across the market, it's actually probably not the right thing to do. What makes more sense is to look at the position in terms of Class A vacancy. Now, the total vacancy in terms of Madrid at the moment is about 10% in the office market. Which actually look at the vacancy rate for Class A, it's probably about 6.87%. So an important variation. So again, if we look at growth, we've seen clearly growth in the prime segment of the market. Rents are up from the bottom of the cycle of about 34, 35%. What's interesting to note, where we actually see potential are those more secondary markets. We think as vacancy continues to fall, and we think we could actually get to about 5% vacancy this year, we see rental growth taking place in some of these more secondary edge of city markets. So again, an important play there. But overall, if we look at the total return trend, and I've discussed this with my team, I mean, we can review some of the figures, but we're still seeing positive returns. In terms of the office segment in Madrid next year, we're talking in excess of 10%. Total returns, both in terms of rental growth and what we believe we'll see in terms of certain yield compression for submarkets. Let's talk about Barcelona. Very similar position, but what's very interesting about Barca, and let's look at it now, if I do the same exercise in terms of converting overall density to the position today as it was back in 2007, 2008, the market is actually outperforming where we were in 2000, 2008. You know, we're seeing a tech boom in terms of the city. Groups coming in, taking large amounts of space. I mean, it shook me last year. I mean, we had King take 9,000 square meters in Barcelona. King's an app company. Candy Crush is their big app, but 9,000 square meters in the market. And this demonstrates the, the level of demand actually coming in. And if we look at the vacancy, we've an overall vacancy rate in terms of Class A stock at below 2% overall. So hence, the top right-hand graph, rental growth coming through, and we see that being sustainable in the short term, next 2 years more or less. Compounded in this case by, if we look here, international demand coming to the market and total returns. Again, I question some of the numbers we're doing here, but we're around 15%, which is very, very positive in the overall context. So I think we can say overall offices, strong demand, growing economy, growing services sector, limited vacancy for the best stock, but positive returns across the board at the end of the day. Let's talk about logistics. Now, logistics is a market I've been looking at very, very carefully recently, including some of the people in this room as well. I think it's unfair to talk about logistics without talking about e-commerce penetration. Let's look at Spain. E-commerce penetration, 4.8%. Less than half the European average. Yeah? Growing at 20% per annum. What's been the impact? Well, let's look at gross take-up. Last 2 years, it has doubled in terms of the occupancy markets from the top graph. But what's actually more interesting for me, if I look at the gross take-up of large operators, i.e. 15,000 square meters and above, it's almost all net, over 90%. Now, again, I'm reviewing these numbers. I mean, they might be 10, 50% off, but this is a market that is growing. There's a supply pipeline coming through. We're looking at that carefully. But the important thing is that the vacancy rates have halved over the past 6 years. Rents have stayed pretty much stable. We see, looking at the bottom right-hand graph, the vacancy again for the Class A stock is less than half. So again, certain submarkets being very specific in terms of where and what sort of asset we believe we're going to see growth in certain submarkets in the short, medium term. And again, we'll talk about it later, but I'm sure there'll be certain comments in respect to that. Now, that's the easy part. Let's talk a bit about retail. I mean, retail itself is a topic that, a lot of conversation is going to take place today on. I have no doubt whatsoever. I'm not here to say that retail is solved in Spain. That's not the question. I'm not saying that. Like any country, we have our challenges. We will resolve those. But I think, it's important to dispel a number of myths I hear in the market. And again, we'll hear some comments later on speaking to some people beforehand. Spain is not overdeveloped in terms of shopping centres. We're below the European average. Of course, there are certain areas in the country where there's more floor space than others, but overall, you look at the European average, we're below that. Importantly, at the same time, it's a transparent market. Sales data is shared in Spain. We know how tenants are performing. We can actually manage the centres accordingly, which is an important issue. We're not dependent in terms of shopping centres on department stores. We have other uses at the same time, and I'm sure Martin will comment on it later on. But equally important, there are certain areas in the country that don't have strong high street locations, and the shopping centre is that destination. So, I think it's important to put things in their context, understand, where the market is, understand the potential. But importantly, and contrary to what I hear from a lot of people in London, sales are still growing. We manage about 2.5 million square meters. So we'd like to understand, we know a bit about the shopping centre, market itself. Year-on-year growth last year, you look at both the top left and top right-hand graphs, we're up 1.3%, albeit lower than previous years. We're seeing footfall on average is more or less the same. I spoke to Martin earlier, the footfall in his top centres is actually up on last year. So I think it's important to recognise where we are. But importantly, you look at future supply, we've got about 3% of the total stock coming through over the next 2-3 years. The European average is 4%. So again, put things into context, understand where we are, dig down to the detail. Not everything is the same. Alternatives. Now, I could be here and talk about alternatives for the next 25 minutes. This is a market, I get confused because people say, alternatives, Reno. Alternatives last year was 20% of the investment volume. I'd say it's actually more mainstream than alternatives at the end of the day. We could talk about, PFS, We could talk about care homes. We could talk about a number of segments, shopping, car parks, or petrol filling stations we've been involved in. I think the star at the moment, and I'll tell you why, what I'm seeing in terms of capital coming to the market is the student housing sector. I think it's something we're going to talk about today. So I thought, well, look, let's do some research on that, and let's look at where we are in terms of the cycle. Spain has about 1.5 million students. All right. Now, again, I'll probably be corrected today by experts looking at this sector alone, and they'll tell me, Reno, it's 1.6, whatever. It's about 1.5. But importantly, you actually look at the growth in population of 18 to 23-year-olds. It's going to grow by about 45%. We have approximately today about 99,000 beds. It's about a 6% provision rate. If you look at Bristol, not a direct comparison, but that's about 36% provision rate. So it gives you an idea of where we are in terms of the market itself. But importantly, what we're seeing is a growth in international students. I mean, you look at Spain itself, you look at the Erasmus program. I mean, we are number one in terms of destination for European students. I understand why. I mean, we talked before about the bars. We talked before about, the tourism. But you can see we've got this big focus on South American, this big focus in this case on European students, with a provision rate which clearly is insufficient for the time being. Again, caution to a certain extent. We're seeing development taking place. We've been involved in a lot of JVs over the past 3 years, about 5,500 beds, I think. But even taking into account everything coming through, the provision rate's still going to reach probably 7.5%, 8%. So I think it's a market that clearly there's an imbalance, an interesting market in terms of dynamics of the market. We'll hear more today as we discuss in more detail the overall position. But I mean, I think the message I'm trying to give is that be confident, look at the market, don't look at the top level data that comes out, dig down. Occupier requirements are changing. It's important to understand where occupiers want to be, and once you get the detail, I think it'll give you a certain amount of confidence in terms of these sub-markets. So that's what I want to say. I've been very brief, which is unusual for me, but I hope that was clear, and we can talk in a bit more detail as we progress. Is that okay, yeah?